And now, it's The Law Show on CL650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law. Now, here's Sterling Fox.
Well, good morning, and welcome to The Law Show here on CL650. Nice to have you along with us. On the program today, we're going to be talking about immigration law as it pertains to new requirements for Canadian citizenship. Just a couple of days ago on Canada Day, thousands of happy people from all over the world became Canadian citizens in the citizenship courts and ceremonies all over our nation. And so we have back with us from the law firm of Maynard, Kisher, Stoychevich, immigration lawyers Rudy Kisher and Gordon Maynard here to talk for an hour about citizenship and, bringing us all up to date on the new citizenship requirements. Rudy and Gordon, good to see you.
Good morning, Sterling.
Good morning, Sterling.
So you couldn't help but see those citizenship ceremonies. On Canada Day, it's a feature of what we do, and every television station in the nation has a clip or two of these happy people receiving their papers and a handshake from a Mountie and the judge and all of that kind of stuff. But the rules have changed since last year. So have these people become citizens in 2015, Rudy, under the old rules or the new rules?
Well, they would have applied most likely under the old rules. But they've been processed now under the new rules and sworn in under the new rules.
So they had the actual goalposts moved while they were in their application period then?
No,
I don't think so.
The process changed, but not the rules for requirements.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Not until recently.
All right.
Yeah.
So, Rudy, why don't you back us up a little bit? I think if we're going to have a decent conversation about citizenship and the new rules and the new process, talk to us about the terminology involved. It gets pretty technical pretty fast. We talk about citizenship. We talk about permanent residency. There are work permits. There are all sorts of variations on the theme. Help us through it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that people sometimes confuse, what those terms mean, and they think, I'm going to come to Canada and I'm going to become a citizen. That's not the way the process works. It's actually a very long process, and it starts off usually with first becoming a permanent resident.
Right. Now, that is the terminology that replaces the old landed immigrant.
Landed immigrant is now removed from the Act. Landed immigrant was moved, I think, in 2002, and after that, it's only permanent residence.
Okay. Again, just for clarification, appreciate that. Okay.
Yeah, there's no difference in the rights, but the terminology now is permanent resident.
Okay.
Immigration lawyers, I think we can break down our world basically into three different types of status, four types of status, I would say. The first, for people in Canada, if they're thinking about their immigration status, there are those people that are in Canada, which we would say without status. So if you think of somebody who has come into Canada as a visitor and overstayed, and they're now they're beyond the period that they were allowed in, they would be most likely without status.
Okay.
Or somebody who snuck in at the border, for example, undetected by immigration coming in, they would be in Canada without status. One grade up from that is somebody here that's here on what we call temporary status.
Okay.
So an immigration officer has met them at the border and allowed them in usually for very set purposes. It usually breaks down into three. Either you're coming in as a visitor, so you're with a set time period, usually 6 months, or you're coming in here to work and you're still in here on temporary status, but you've been given permission to work. And another common one that we see is you're allowed in to study. So those people are here for a finite amount of time. The expectation is that they should be willing and able to leave if they're requested to leave, and that's what the immigration officer has to sort of assess when they arrive at the border and when they're coming in. They don't have a lot of long-term rights associated with that status in Canada.
It's basically a 6-month window of opportunity.
Or maybe it's even longer, a year or 2 years, depending on how long the work permits. Some work permits are issued up for 3 years or 5 years. 5 years not that common anymore.
Okay.
But that does happen. But But the rights associated with that are very limited. The next step up from that is, as the term would say, would imply, is what we call a permanent resident, and that is similar to if people are watch movies from the United States and they talk about getting your green card.
Right.
That is the Canadian equivalent. Some people call getting your permanent resident card getting your maple leaf card. They call it.
Sure.
And that gives you the right. It's an actual right that's ingrained in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that a person who is a permanent resident has certain rights and has a right to enter Canada. And with that, you have appeal rights that, and you also have obligations. But you can stay in Canada as long as you like. You can work or not work. You can work at anything you like. But you also have certain restrictions that, are not as good as being a citizen in terms of your rights, aren't as secure because you have certain obligations. Obligations such as remaining in Canada a certain amount of time period, or not committing a horrible crime. If you violate, those are the two major ones, you could be removed from Canada. Unlike citizens, generally, even if you, until recently, if you committed a horrible crime, you would still remain a Canadian citizen, or if you were gone for Canada for a long time, you would still remain a Canadian citizen. And of course, you can't, as a permanent resident, you can't vote. In certain respects, you can't serve in certain parts of military.
But you sure can pay taxes, can't you?
You can definitely, and you should pay taxes in a lot of cases. Yes, that's been in the media a lot these days.
We're pretty quick to send the bill. Aren't we?
Yeah.
So now, what's category number 4 then, Rudy?
Well, we talked about with status, right? Without status.
Yep, temporary status.
Temporary status, permanent residency, and the fourth one is citizenship.
Oh, citizenship.
So citizenship is the gold standard. That is, as an immigration lawyer, if we're trying to get people's rights, those are the rights we want to get because that allows somebody to stay in Canada. If something goes wrong in their life, they get charged with a crime, they don't have to worry about being generally removed from Canada. If they have to leave Canada for long periods of time, they're allowed to come back to Canada, and they're allowed to sort of fully participate in Canadian political life, run for office, vote, etc., which permanent residents generally are not allowed to do.
It's interesting because a person who becomes a Canadian citizen going through all of the channels, unlike the United States, that person ultimately could become the prime minister. Where in the United States, a person not born in the United States can never become president.
Yeah, I understand Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't like that. He was thinking about trying to get the Constitution in the States changed. No, we have no prohibition from, former permanent residents running for office in Canada.
Gordon, you talked about the process having changed. I said they moved the goalposts. You said no, but the process has changed. So how?
Well, the changes to the Citizenship Act were both about the process and about the rules.
Okay,
the criteria. So, for instance, the old rule was that you had to reside in Canada for 3 years out of the previous 4. Okay, let's say 3 years of feeding Canada out of the previous 4 years before the application. This has now changed to 4 years out of 6, but they've only recently put that into place, that part of it.
Okay.
The old rule was still applying all the way through. So all these people that are getting citizenship today have done so under the old standards.
Okay.
But there were a lot of changes too, as well, under the Act, to the process. So, for instance, what was the role of a citizenship judge? What was the role of a minister's official? Who was making the decision? Who can make a decision on citizenship? Those parts of the rules changed earlier so that they could get more processing done.
Okay.
So in some cases, it's the process that's changed. In other cases, it's the rules that's changed. And eventually, all of the provisions of the Citizenship Act will come into force, and the whole act will be enacted.
One of the big knocks on the immigration system that we have in Canada is that it's ponderous. It moves very slowly, and for decades we've been dealing with massive backlogs. And I think there's still a fairly commonly held public opinion, Rudy, that there is an enormous pool of people trying to get into Canada, and the government keeps changing the rules and the process in order to expedite things, to get that long lineup reduced at the door. Is that the case?
Well, I think in terms of citizenship, up until recently, applications that were submitted were taking an extreme time, in my opinion, extreme time. Some of them were taking 3 years. They had increased. They had found that there was a lot of fraud. Well, when I say a lot, there was a couple cases where I think the numbers were sort of about 3,000 people were found to have applied for citizenship completely fraudulently, assisted by an individual who helped them sort of set up phone numbers, addresses, billing numbers, and even in one case trying to get some sort of government rebate on rent paid or something like that, so that they could show that people were here when they actually weren't. And, and that caused the government to sort of respond with what they call these residency questionnaires, which would be like a 7-page document, and requesting booklets that were 3 or 4 inches thick to be submitted in terms of showing that you were actually in Canada. And that, you can imagine, just all of a sudden caused a massive slowdown in the system. Somebody who applied a while ago might be getting citizenship. Some of those people that were, just got citizenship on July 1st.
That's right.
They might have been waiting 3 years. But in our office now, we're seeing people that having applied under this new process are actually getting through, some of them in less than a year, which is shocking for us because I haven't seen processing that fast in years. And that's part of this new expedited process where it's simplified and not everything goes through a citizenship judge anymore.
So, Gordon, there's some progress being made on as Rudy says, on the matter of citizenship. But it's not across the board universal in terms of success, is it? Because work permits and changes to the work permit aspect of coming into Canada, it's still kind of bogged down, isn't it? Because of the changes, among other things.
Sure, and you're talking about an entirely separate scheme.
Right,
You're talking about
right.
work permits and permanent
But
residence
I'm also
status.
talking about public perception, which is, I think, most of us just think, well, the whole immigration thing, we think of it as one unit. And it's broken down into so many different categories and reasons. But I think in terms of the public impression of how immigration works in Canada, we sort of lump it all together.
I think it was fair to lump it all together in the sense that everything was broken in terms of backlogs.
Yeah.
A year ago, everything was broken. All right, nothing was happening efficiently. There's been a lot of changes since then, in almost every level of immigration. Whether you're talking about work permits, whether you're talking about permanent residence status, or whether you're talking about citizenship.
Okay.
And so within each of those areas, now you're seeing some progress, certainly in citizenship. Are you seeing progress in work permits? No, they're still slow.
Right.
And in some cases, they're slower than they ever have been. Yeah, if you have to go through an LMIA process, the Labor Market Impact Assessment, still a slow process.
Okay.
If you're talking about permanent residence status, now we have express entry, which everybody was hearing about in January when it was implemented. We've gotten to the point where we're now, 6 months, 7 months into express entry. We're still waiting for numbers of people to be landed under it. A lot of people are in process. They've gotten invitations to apply. They've put in their applications, but they're not getting the work permit that they're supposed to get as a bridging work permit, for instance.
Oh.
So this is causing problems. People are still waiting for that to happen. It's supposed to be a 6-month processing time, and so we're still within that time frame that the government said they were going to operate. Let's see if people make it through that.
So some aspects of immigration enforcement and implementation are more successful, Rudy, than others. The citizenship thing, just on a personal opinion, seems to be the easiest matter for the government to deal with when it comes to the documentation and so on, as opposed to work permits and stuff. No? Okay, well then tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, because actually the easiest thing for them to deal with are the permanent resident applications.
Okay.
Because they've outsourced that to third parties. You need to show language ability, that's done by a test, third-party test. You need to show education, that's done by a third-party assessment. You want to show your work experience, they require you to put in employer letters verifying what your work history is.
Okay.
So you're expected to put in a perfected application. When it comes to citizenship, it is based on your time in Canada, feet in Canada. And that's sometimes a very hard thing to show. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard. And the government has to sift through those and say, do we have the evidence to show that that person has been here? So that actually can become a very difficult application, particularly if you suspect that the people are being fraudulent in the documents that they're given to you.
Yeah, and Rudy, you mentioned fraud a couple of moments ago. So I'm curious about this requirement that you both talked about already. This, in order to become a Canadian citizen, you need to of course you have to get your permanent resident papers, and then you have to conform to a certain number of criteria. One of which is you have to live in this country X number of days per year for 4 out of 6 years.
4 out of 6 years.
Now, what is? I understand it, but what is the government reason saying that whatever the minimum number of days per year you have to live in this country in order to qualify eventually to become a citizen? It seems to make sense on the surface of things, but what is the government justification for that?
I think, I mean, as the bill that they put forward and the act was called, Canadian strengthening Canadian citizenship, harder to get, easier to lose.
Right.
And so I think the opinion out there that 3 years, the past requirement was that you had to be 3 out of 4 years. There were three real problems that arose with the old act that they wanted to address. The first one was permanent residency wasn't defined in the act, which caused a lot of problems in terms of residency wasn't defined. So were you resident in Canada? Did that mean feet on the ground? Or did that mean, well, I live here, but I go vacation in Florida for 4 months a year?
Or some of my family lives here and I pop in every now and then.
But I have a house here,
right,
and I file $20,000 worth of taxes. Is that being resident in Canada? And, the government became increasingly uncomfortable with having to sort of make decisions on the way decisions were going in terms of people being here less and less time and being sort of resident here but not physically here. And this government has come out and said, we're going to make it clear that we want you physically here. The other thing that they wanted to address was the time frame of being 3 out of 4. Well, that's 75% of the time.
Right.
They're looking at that. If we're going to make it physical time, then we're going to spread it over more time to allow people to comply. We're taking a look at the person who travels a lot for business, travels for families. We're going to be a little bit more lenient on that and make it 4 out of 6 years, so give a little bit more flexibility with that. And I think they were looking around at our partners to the south, looking at Australians and seeing how many years people take to become citizens.
Right.
I mean, 3 years, you can't get an undergraduate degree in that time.
Right.
Right. But you can qualify for Canadian citizenship.
Interesting stuff.
So I think the thought was that it was we were a little bit too light in the time commitment.
So now, Gordon, it's about boots on the ground, minimum numbers of time, or you're not getting in.
Not only that, it's also about tax.
Oh.
Yeah, some interesting quirks in the law.
How so?
Well, it's interesting because they say, yes, in order to be eligible to apply, you have to have 4 years time in Canada out of the previous 6 years.
Okay.
Also, you have to have 4 years during that 6-year period in which you were in Canada for at least 183 days. Now, that's an interesting requirement. Why have they put that in there? Because mathematically, it doesn't change anything. But it does require you to be you can't declare yourself non-resident for tax purposes.
Oh, I see.
Because that requires you, once you're in Canada for 183 days, now you're obliged
to file at the end of the tax year.
To meet the tax laws.
Right, okay.
So now in the requirements for applying for citizenship, it's 4 years out of 6, 4 years in which you're here at least 183 days each of those years, and you have to comply with the tax requirements, file a tax return as required, whatever that is. Okay?
Right.
So now they're beginning to look in at tax requirements as part of the citizenship application.
Oh, and the fee's gone up too.
Oh, yeah.
It's gone up from what, $200 to $600?
Yeah, over the time frame. The last increase was
all those
$100.
people we saw on TV last Wednesday. Did they pay $200? Or did they pay $600?
They likely paid $200. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so
or not even that.
Next July 1st, they'll be paying $600 and some dollars.
$630 per adult.
Interesting.
And another
stuff.
$200 for kids.
Wow. Our guest friends are Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher. The firm is Maynard Kisher Stoichovich. We're talking immigration law on this episode of The Law Show, and there's lots more still to come. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.